As Halloween approaches, so do the times during which people tell spooky tales. And certainly after 2020, the horror stories will be plenty. When it comes to fantasy, most of the good stories have a darker twist to them, something you wouldn't expect. And the world of League of Legends is no exception to this. Runeterra has many creepy places scattered around which have a dark story of their own. And the stories of these places are something that's worth exploring in these spooky times. And so, today, we are not necessarily going to have a look at the most brutal or deadliest places on Runeterra. After all, while gore and blood is disgusting, it doesn't have to be scary. But in this video, we will surely dive into all the unsettling places that evoke fear and dread. Let's start with a lighter one. Despite it being the land of nature and beauty, Ionia has its share of scary things. From the ever-hungry Azakana, to the Ionian bombs that prevent you from sleeping by mimicking the sound of screaming children, to the uncanny shape-shifting Vastaya, to trees. After all, if you have ever watched National Geographic, you know that nature can be scary. But Ionia is far, far worse. In the Sisterhood of War series, where a Noxian band traveled to Ionia to find and capture Riven, we read about all the horrors the Ionian land itself threw at the Noxian invaders. During one night, a nearby river just decided to lift up, turn into a watery creature and flood a Noxian camp. Another night, they met a strange winged creature that morphed in and out of existence, and which made rain fall upside down. And another time, when the Noxians tried to gather wood, they made sure to only pick it up from the ground, because were they to strike a living tree, the tree would fight back, and not in the prettiest of ways. If you were lucky, it would only strangle you with its roots in your sleep. Otherwise, as Zaya witnessed, the plants can morph into all kinds of giant horrific insect-like creatures. But even if that isn't enough, the trees can call the forest spirits for help. In the same story, Zaya saw them as small spiritual butterflies that lift you up from the ground, and once you are high above the trees, they just let go and watch as you break on the stones below. But strangely, you don't necessarily need to be Ionia's enemy to fall victim to those spirits. In fact, while you are in Ionia, in some magically touched places, the land itself can sense how your body is imprisoning your own spirit, and how your spirit wants to be free. And so, nature just wants to do you a favor, by crushing your bones and ripping the soul from your fragile body. Next up, let's have a look at a place that is not especially scary, but that holds a dark twist creepier than any other region. Ishtal. At first, Ishtal may feel like your totally normal region. It sits hidden in the jungles. It is focusing on mastering elemental magic, and Malphite was created here. But very recently, we learned that the people of Ishtal lived their happy lives, oblivious to the reality around them. You see, after Icathia went to war against the Shuriman Emperor, and after Icathia regrettably decided to use the enemy of all life on Runeterra as a secret weapon, the Icathian lands south of Ishtal became corrupted by the Void. Thankfully, unlike Shurima, who just let those lands be, and who are getting ready to deal with all sorts of other problems, Ishtal was aware of how dangerous the Void was. And so, Nezuk, an ascended Ishtali mage, and the original wielder of the glove Ezreal has now, constructed a massive floating city. He flew on it to Icathia, and he used giant magical death beams to burn the Void out. Unfortunately, the Void was unstoppable, and so it struck down the floating city, it made Nezuk flee for his life, possible future champion by the way, and to top it all off, the Shuriman Emperor died, which made the Ascended go crazy and start a whole new world-devastating war. At this point, Ishtal had enough, and so they were like, you know what? It's not our problem anymore. After which they used their elemental magic to raise giant thick walls made out of vines and plants, which effectively isolated them from the rest of the world. But here's the thing. After losing the most powerful mage they had ever known in a battle against the Void, the leaders of Ishtal believed that the Void would soon consume the entire world. And so they stayed isolated for many years, believing that the world outside was doomed, and that they were the only human survivors on Runeterra. The reason why no one ever bothered to check if this is actually the case is because the Ishtali believe that stepping outside of their borders would be certain death. The Axiomata story explained that they think the void consumed all life on Runeterra, including the air itself. So if someone stepped outside, they believe they would instantly suffocate. These days there are only very few who know about the world outside. Only the most powerful wielders of elemental magic get to learn about it, because after entire generations of living in isolation, a lesser mind would break under the weight of the truth. And so the leaders of Ishtal are still figuring out how to carefully tell their people that there is an entire living world outside. Because if they do it wrong, they may make their entire region fall into madness. And speaking of madness, we have to check out Demacia. Demacia is a place riddled with the most horrifying, hideous and disgusting plague humanity had ever known: racism. But what's worse, it is also plagued with the most horrifying first world problem: insomnia. You see, north of the capital city, in a town called Fosbarrow, very long time ago, Lux's great-grandfather, Phocian Crownguard, fought a demon, who ended up being Nocturne. While he didn't slay Nocturne, at the cost of his life, at least he banished him in a hidden place. However, many years later, a small boy stumbled upon Phocian's tomb, which gave Nocturne the chance to use the boy as his vessel. After that, Nocturne was free to spread his shadow magic around the lands. And of course, because his specialty were nightmares, he struck the citizens of Demacia in their sleep. At first, people noticed they felt a bit more tired than usual. Then, when they fell asleep, they saw this dark figure in their dreams. It hunted them there, and oftentimes, it forced people to wake up from their nightmare screaming. But that was the better outcome. Later, people started randomly dying in their beds, because it turned out, when the dark figure actually caught them in their dream, they died in real life too. This forced people into sleeping as little as possible, because the longer they stayed in their nightmare, the higher the chance of them dying. But that wasn't the worst thing. Over time, the lack of sleep got into people's heads, and they became delusional. Even after they woke up from their nightmares, they kept seeing the shadows in real life too. And so, in self-defense, they started attacking them, only to later realize that these shadows were just an illusion, and they actually murdered their friends and family. So among all of this madness, people also started accusing each other of being murderers. Mere weeks after Nocturne took root in Fosbarrow, the situation got so bad people started abandoning all the towns in the north. Later, Lux learned about what was happening, and she traveled here to investigate. In her story, Lux described how the towns in the north were mostly empty, left for a few people who stuck around, too tired to actually move away. These people who were left behind were devoid of any will to live. They were too tired to stay awake, too afraid to fall asleep. At the end of the story, Garen arrived there with his dauntless vanguard, and they fought all kinds of shadowy beasts spawning from the nightmares. Which, by the way, happened years before Legends of Runeterra gave them forms. And while they were doing this, Lux found Phocian's tomb, and using her light, she purged Nocturne from the boy's body. It was never explained what happened to Nocturne after that, but since Legends of Runeterra assigned him to the Shadow Isles, we can assume that's where he ended up. Next, let's move away from magic and let's have a look at some creepy science. Zoan is a pretty scary place on its own. It's full of backstabbing, front stabbing, feet stabbing, and all other kinds of stabbings. And really, here I could talk about a lot of horrifying stories. But I want to show you one you may not actually know about. There is one specific place where things get a different kind of creepy vibes. And that is the first assemblage of the Glorious Evolved, also known as the Church of the Augmented. Now, here you may think that I'm going to talk about how crazy Victor is, how he started his own religion, and how devoted he is to meddle over flesh. But the truth is the opposite. Victor lives in an old house which no one ever visits. There, from his lab, he helps people by fixing their limbs and easing their pain. In his story, there was a kid that was being bullied, and so Victor offered the kid to try a little augment. It was a metal bead which he implanted behind the kid's ear. It would enhance the kit's strength, but it would dissolve and disappear over a few days. By doing this, he made the kid's life easier, by giving him a chance to fight back the bullies. But if he didn't like it, the effects would go away on their own. So as you can see, Victor is a really awesome and kind-hearted person, despite what he is like in the game.
Destroy, then improve.
And even though Victor doesn't seem to work for fame or attention, that didn't stop people from appreciating his work. However, some appreciated it a bit too much. It turns out some people got obsessed by augments, and they actually started their own religion. Now here I should mention that Victor definitely wasn't the only one who augmented people's body parts. There were many like him. So despite the religion being called the Glorious Evolved, which heavily implies that it was inspired by Victor's work, we technically don't know how it all started. Anyway, when Camille first walked into their church, she heard about 50 or so people murmuring in a roiling unison. They spoke the words, "The body is frail, the flesh is weak." All of them had parts of their bodies augmented, and they covered what little flesh remained with drapes of dark cloth. To these people, it didn't matter whether one came from Piltover or Zone, or whether their metal replacements were expensive or cheap. All that mattered was that they were augmented. The person who showed this church to Camille was Brother Xavier, a man with a balding head, whose entire mouth was replaced by a breathing apparatus. First, he showed Camille paintings of the Grey Lady, which was the holy patron of the Glorious Evolved. And strangely, looking at Camille's high-end hextech metal body, some thought that Camille herself was the Grey Lady. Then Xavier showed her their shrine, and that's where the creepy part started. This is what Camille saw. There were jars of organs, single eyeballs floated like pickled eggs. Bundled offerings were wrapped in linen, some of it fine, some of it oily and ragged. A few flies buzzed among the discarded pieces of the congregation. One of the wrapped bundles moved. A little plague rat poked its nose out shortly after, daring me to take away its prize. The gauze of the newfound treasure caught on the edge, and the rest of the bundle tumbled away, revealing a desiccated finger. The rat scampered down, but Brother Xavier shooed it back into the darkness. Now, removing parts of their body and replacing them with metal counterparts is one thing, but these people cut off parts of their flesh, pickle it in a jar, and place it at a shrine as an offering. And the reason why they do this has a story of its own. You see, in Piltover, every year there is a celebration called the Progress Day. On this day, all inventors come out and show off their inventions. And usually, this is how Piltovans discover new ways to progress in science, hence the name Progress Day. Well, here in Zone, the Glorious Evolved see the Progress Day as the day they can chop off parts of their body. For what is progress, if not the enhancement of human life? And finally, I want to talk about the most brutal, gory, creepy, unsettling, and by far the most disgusting story I have ever read in the League of Legends universe. The story of the Ursine, which somehow also became one of my favorites. You see, Freljord already has quite a few creepy places, be it the entombed frozen watchers underneath the Frostguard Citadel, or the graveyard of the Yeti civilization right beside it. But nothing comes even close to what was revealed in the story called Silence for the Damned. Here, Udyr helped Sejuani make a deal with the Ursine. The problem is, the Ursine are by far the wildest and most brutal people on Runeterra. Normally, Freljord is full of shamans who can shapeshift into primal animals. They do this by channeling the powers of the primal gods, which means that they can shift into bears, boars, lynxes, and dozens of others. But for the Ursine, there is a twist. If we travel even further north from the Freljord mainland, we can find a small place called Ursine Lands. In this isolated place, the shamans worship the Volibear. To them, the Volibear is an unstoppable wild force that is stronger than anything else. Of course, we know that the power behind the Volibear is Volibear, the primal god. However, the Ursine are so devoted to this power that they blindly follow his vision no matter what. The problem begins when you realize that Volibear wants to wipe out all humanity because they started building houses, herding animals and farming crops, instead of hunting and surviving as it always was. Just the mere sight of civilization starts a bloodlust inside Volibear, and that's where the Ursine brutal ways originated from. But now you may be asking, how bad can the Ursine really be? Well, let me show you. First of all, we have the quote-unquote normal Ursine devoters. These berserkers evoke the power of the Volibear by sacrificing animals, or in the worst case, they sacrifice their fellow believers. They usually cut them open, and they spray their insides all over their body and the snow around an altar. This evokes the Volibear's wild force, which brainwashes them and fills them with an unstoppable bloodlust. With this power, the Ursine raid nearby villages. And after the battle, as Udyr himself witnessed, some of the berserkers cover their faces with the enemy's blood, and they even eat their prey, which are mostly other people. But those are just the Ursine berserkers. The shamans are even more horrifying. As we mentioned, the Freljordian shamans channel the wild animalistic forces to shape forms. But the Ursine shamans are, let's say, too dedicated to the art of shapeshifting. Over time, the brainwashing power of the Volibear makes the shaman's bear forms permanent. So, as they shift into bears more and more often, they eventually just become beasts. But that wouldn't be so bad considering what else can the Volibear shape them into. This is what Udyr witnessed when he encountered the Ursine in a forest. The first of the Ursine slipped out from between the black forest trees without a sound. Savages, with their skin stained brown with blood. Their hair matted with filth. Some were naked, others wore bear hides or rotting remains of clothes. Next came the beasts, bears mostly, of various sizes and colors. Some breeds Udyr knew, others he had never seen before. They were spirit walkers trapped in the form of the unrelenting bear, men who had forgotten they were men. Then came the monsters. They were strange amalgamations of bears and other creatures, things of legends, dreams and folklore. They had all been men once too, but now, so consumed by the true spirit, they had paused beyond what normal animals looked like. The largest of them, a huge bear-like thing, lumbered out of the forest. Where its head should have been, a decayed elk skull rested on a mane of black feathers, eyes glowing with blue fire. It opened its jaw to reveal a child's face inside its maw. Then the child opened its own mouth too, spewing a foul brown liquid. Other nightmares followed it from the woods, limping, crawling, and shambling forward. And so, as you can see, when we are talking about creepy and unsettling places, nothing gets worse than the horrors of the Ursine. And that is it for this list. There were definitely other places I could have focused on, such as the Watchers in the north, or all the creepy ghosts on the Shadow Isles. But I wanted to talk about places you probably didn't know about. But if I missed something really obvious and creepy, feel free to let everyone know. For what is Halloween for, if not for sharing scary stories? Candy. I agree the holidays are good for candy too.